March 1975. The Grammy Awards ceremony. Hollywood's brightest night. Backstage, tuxedos shimmered under fluorescent lights. Diamond earrings caught the glow, and champagne glasses clinked in celebration. But that night, what happened between two rock legends would be talked about far more than any award handed out on stage. David Bowie stood in the corridor, his orange hair perfectly styled, his elegant costume a statement of controlled chaos. Just 30 minutes earlier, he had walked off stage to thunderous applause, thousands mesmerized by his performance. But the sound that now echoed down the hallway froze every conversation, stopped every celebration cold. A scream, raw, unfiltered rage. John Lennon was drunk, very drunk, and he was walking straight toward Bowie, fists clenched, eyes burning with an anger that seemed to come from somewhere far deeper than alcohol. "You!" he shouted, his finger stabbing the air toward Bowie's face. "You're a goddamn fraud!" Everyone in the corridor froze. Security guards sprang into action, but before they could intervene, Lennon had closed the distance to barely 3 feet from Bowie. The smell of whiskey filled the space between them. "You copied the Beatles! You stole from Dylan! You've exploited all of us!" Lennon's voice trembled with fury. "And now you stand here like you invented it all!" Bowie didn't move. His face remained expressionless, that famous 1,000-yard stare from his mismatched eyes fixed on Lennon without a flicker of emotion. Before we continue with what happened next, if you want to hear more untold stories about David Bowie's life, the secrets, the scandals, and the moments that shaped rock history, please subscribe to our channel. These stories deserve to be remembered. The security guards moved forward, hands reaching for Lennon's shoulders, but Bowie raised his hand in a single, deliberate gesture. "No," he said, his voice calm, almost a whisper. "Let him speak." That decision, that moment of allowing chaos to continue rather than shutting it down, would define everything that followed. Because what happened in the next 10 minutes wasn't just a drunken confrontation between two famous musicians. It was something far more profound, something that revealed the fault lines running through rock and roll in 1975, the generational shift that was tearing the music world apart. To understand that night, you have to understand where both men were standing in their lives. David Bowie, at 28 years old, was riding a wave that seemed unstoppable. Ziggy Stardust had changed everything 3 years earlier, demolishing the boundaries between gender, sexuality, and performance. He had killed Ziggy in 1973 at Hammersmith Odeon, but the legend had only grown. Diamond Dogs had come out the previous year, and now he was working on Young Americans, pivoting into soul and funk with a confidence that bordered on arrogance. But beneath the surface, Bowie was fracturing. The cocaine had already started its slow destruction. He barely slept, barely ate, living on a diet of milk, red peppers, and white powder. He was beginning to lose track of where David Jones ended and his characters began. The masks he wore on stage were starting to feel more real than the face beneath them. John Lennon, meanwhile, was drowning. The Beatles had been dead for 5 years, but the ghost of that band haunted him every single day. His marriage to Yoko Ono was in tatters after his 18-month lost weekend affair with May Pang. He had just returned to New York, trying to piece together what remained of his identity. At 34, he was being called a relic, yesterday's news, while younger artists like Bowie were being hailed as the future. The Grammy ceremony that night was supposed to be a celebration, but for Lennon, it felt like a funeral for everything he had once represented. And then he saw Bowie in that corridor, surrounded by admirers, photographers snapping pictures, everyone treating him like royalty. Something inside Lennon snapped. "You want to know what you are?" Lennon continued, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper that somehow carried across the entire corridor. "You're a mime. A pretty little mime who copies everyone else and calls it art." The people around them gasped. Someone tried to step between them, but Bowie's hand remained raised, keeping everyone at bay. His eyes never left Lennon's face. "The androgyny? We were doing that in Hamburg in 1960. The concept albums? Sergeant Pepper invented that. The theatrical shows? We played Shea Stadium when you were still in art school." Lennon's face was inches from Bowie's now. "You haven't created anything original. You just repackage what we built and sell it to kids who don't know any better." The silence that followed was suffocating. Everyone waited for Bowie's response, for the explosion that had to come. Because this wasn't just an insult. This was an attack on everything Bowie had built, everything he claimed to represent. But Bowie didn't explode. Instead, he smiled. A small, sad smile that seemed to contain decades of understanding that Lennon, in his drunken rage, couldn't possibly grasp yet. "You're right," Bowie said quietly. The corridor erupted in confused murmurs. Lennon himself seemed taken aback, his anger momentarily deflated by the unexpected agreement. "I did copy you," Bowie continued, his voice still calm, still controlled. "I copied you, and Bob, and Little Richard, and every artist who came before me. Because that's what artists do, John. We steal. We take what inspired us and we transform it into something new." Lennon's jaw clenched. "Don't patronize me." "I'm not," Bowie said, and for the first time a hint of emotion crept into his voice. "I'm telling you the truth you already know but don't want to hear. You copied Buddy Holly. You copied Chuck Berry. You copied every American rock and roller who came before you, and you made it British. Made it yours. That wasn't theft. That was art." What happened next has been described differently by every person who was there that night. Some say Lennon took a step back, his anger suddenly giving way to something that looked like confusion. Others say he lunged forward and had to be restrained by security. But everyone agrees on one thing. The conversation that followed changed the entire tone of the encounter. "The difference," Lennon said, his voice cracking slightly, "is that we believed in something. We believed in the music. You just believe in the costume." And there it was. The real accusation beneath all the anger. Not that Bowie was a copycat or a fraud, but that he was empty. That all the personas and characters and theatrical presentations were hollow, lacking the authentic soul that had driven the Beatles, that had driven a generation. Bowie's expression finally changed. The mask slipped for just a moment, and something raw and wounded flashed across his face. When he spoke again, his voice was barely audible. "You think I don't believe? You think I chose to disappear behind these characters because it's fun?" He paused, and in that pause, everyone watching could feel the weight of whatever he was about to say. "I hide behind them, John, because I don't know who I am without them anymore. And that terrifies me every single day." The confession hung in the air like smoke. Lennon stared at Bowie, and in that moment, something passed between them. A recognition. A shared understanding of what it meant to lose yourself in the machinery of fame. To become a character that the world demanded you play, over and over, until you couldn't remember who you were supposed to be. Security was still hovering, waiting for the situation to explode into violence. The Grammy producers were desperately trying to figure out how to separate the two men without creating a scene that would dominate tomorrow's headlines. But Bowie and Lennon seemed to exist in a bubble now, their confrontation having evolved into something more intimate, more painful than anyone watching could fully understand. "Do you know what the worst part is?" Lennon said, and his voice had changed entirely. The anger was gone, replaced by something that sounded almost like despair. "I see you up there, doing your thing, being whoever you're pretending to be that week, and I'm jealous. Not of your success, of your ability to still pretend it matters." Bowie nodded slowly. "It's easier to pretend when you're young." "I'm not old," Lennon shot back, but there was no heat in it. "No," Bowie agreed. "But we're both dying. In different ways, maybe, but we're both dying." The hallway had gone completely silent. Even the background noise of the ceremony seemed to have faded away, leaving just these two men, two legends, admitting to each other what they couldn't admit to anyone else. Years later, when people who were there that night finally started talking about what they witnessed, they all emphasized this moment, the shift from confrontation to confession, from anger to vulnerability. It was as if Lennon's drunken attack had accidentally torn open a wound that both men had been trying to hide, and now, faced with each other's pain, they couldn't help but acknowledge their own. Marcus Webb, a security guard who was standing less than 10 feet away, would later describe the scene in an interview he gave decades after that night. "I've worked hundreds of events," he said. "I've seen fights, I've seen breakdowns, I've seen every kind of celebrity meltdown you can imagine. But I've never seen anything like that moment between Lennon and Bowie. It was like watching two people have a conversation that the rest of us weren't supposed to hear." Sarah Mitchell, a production assistant who was holding a clipboard and trying to figure out when to usher people back to their seats, remembered the way the corridor seemed to hold its breath. "Everyone was frozen," she recalled. "We all wanted to move, to do something, but it felt wrong somehow, like we were witnessing something sacred." The photographer who had been snapping pictures earlier had lowered his camera. He would later say that he couldn't bring himself to photograph what was happening. "It felt too private," he explained. "Too real." Finally, after what felt like hours but was probably only a few minutes, Lennon took a step back. He swayed slightly, the alcohol catching up with him, and for a moment it looked like he might fall. But he steadied himself against the wall and looked at Bowie with eyes that were suddenly, startlingly clear. "I'm sorry," he said simply. Bowie shook his head. "Don't be. You said what needed to be said." "I said what I was afraid to say about myself," Lennon corrected. "I know," Bowie replied. They stood there for another moment, and then Lennon did something that shocked everyone watching. He extended his hand. Bowie looked at it for a long moment, and then he reached out and clasped it. They shook hands, and then, almost simultaneously, they both smiled. Small, sad smiles that acknowledged everything that had just passed between them. "Good luck," Lennon said quietly. "You too," Bowie replied. And then Lennon turned and walked away, weaving slightly but maintaining his dignity. Security followed him at a discreet distance, making sure he made it safely out of the building. Bowie watched him go, his expression unreadable once again, the mask sliding back into place. The corridor erupted into nervous chatter as soon as Lennon disappeared around the corner. Everyone had an opinion, a theory about what had just happened. But Bowie simply turned and walked back into his dressing room, closing the door behind him with a soft click. What happened after that night has been the subject of speculation and rumor for decades. No major publications reported on the confrontation at the time. The Grammy organizers made sure that everyone who witnessed it understood that discretion was expected, even required. A scandal of that magnitude could damage both men's careers irreparably. But people talked. In private conversations, at parties, in the industry circles where gossip was currency, the story spread. And with each telling, it grew and mutated, becoming more dramatic, more violent, more scandalous. Some versions had Bowie throwing a drink in Lennon's face. Others had security tackling Lennon to the ground. One particularly wild rumor claimed that Yoko Ono had been there and had slapped Bowie across the face. None of it was true. But the real story, the quiet conversation between two men confronting their own demons while the world watched, was somehow too subtle for the mythology that grew up around it. In the months that followed, both men would reference that night indirectly in interviews, though neither ever confirmed publicly that it had happened. Lennon, in a Rolling Stone interview later that year, talked about meeting younger artists and feeling like a ghost haunting the party. Bowie, in an interview with Playboy in 1976, mentioned having a confrontation with someone I deeply respected that made him question whether any of this performance, any of these characters, meant anything real. But there was something else happening that night, something that went beyond just two men having an argument in a hallway. What Lennon and Bowie were really fighting about, whether they fully understood it or not, was the changing nature of rock and roll itself. The 1960s had been about authenticity, about meaning it, about using music as a vehicle for social change and personal truth. The Beatles, Dylan, the Stones, all the giants of that era had built their legends on the idea that they were real, that their music came from a place of genuine emotion and experience. But Bowie represented something different. He represented the idea that authenticity was itself a performance, that the self was something malleable and constructed rather than discovered. Ziggy Stardust wasn't real, but he was real in performance, and that performance had real effects on real people. The question Lennon was really asking wasn't whether Bowie was a fraud. It was whether Bowie's approach to art invalidated everything Lennon's generation had fought for. And Bowie's answer, his confession that he didn't know who he was anymore without his characters, was an acknowledgement that maybe Lennon was right to be worried. Maybe the future Bowie represented was one where the self dissolved entirely into performance, where authenticity became obsolete. There's another layer to this story that's important to understand. By March 1975, Bowie's cocaine use was already spiraling out of control. He wouldn't hit rock bottom until the following year in Los Angeles, when his paranoia and delusions would nearly destroy him completely. But the seeds were already planted. Some people who were close to Bowie during that period have suggested that his response to Lennon, that night, his calm acceptance of the accusations, and his vulnerable confession might have been influenced by where he was mentally at that moment. The cocaine was already starting to tear down the walls between his personas and his real self, making it harder to maintain the cool, controlled exterior he usually presented to the world. In a way, Lennon's drunken attack might have caught Bowie at one of the few moments when he couldn't simply put on another mask and deflect. The drugs had made him too raw, too exposed. So instead of defending himself or walking away, he told the truth. And that truth resonated with Lennon because Lennon, in his own alcohol-soaked haze, was just as exposed, just as unable to maintain his own defenses. Two men, both hiding from themselves in different substances, both confronting the hollowness at the center of their fame. That was the real story of that night. In the years that followed, both men would struggle with the demons they had acknowledged to each other that night. Lennon would retreat from public life, becoming a house husband and father, trying to find meaning in domesticity after years of searching for it in music and fame. He would return to recording in 1980, just months before his murder, with an album that seemed to suggest he had finally found some peace. Bowie would descend deeper into addiction, relocating to Los Angeles, and then, famously, fleeing to Berlin to save his life and sanity. The Berlin Trilogy, those 3 albums he recorded with Brian Eno between 1977 and 1979, would represent his own attempt to find something real beneath all the performance. Low, Heroes, and Lodger were, in many ways, Bowie's answer to the question Lennon had posed that night in the corridor. In 1983, Bowie would have massive commercial success with Let's Dance, but even that triumph would be tinged with the anxiety that he was once again just performing, just giving people what they wanted, rather than what he needed to express. He would spend the rest of the 1980s wrestling with that tension, sometimes successfully, sometimes not. The irony is that both men, in their different ways, were searching for the same thing, a way to be authentic in a world that demanded performance, a way to be real when reality itself had become commodified. Neither ever fully solved that puzzle. But in acknowledging it to each other that night, in admitting their shared fear and confusion, they created a moment of genuine connection in an industry built on fakery. The witnesses break their silence. It would take decades before people who were there that night felt comfortable talking about what they had witnessed. The culture of silence that the Grammy organizers had imposed was powerful, reinforced by the fact that both Bowie and Lennon seemed to want the incident kept private. But after Lennon's death in 1980, and especially after Bowie's death in 2016, the witnesses began to speak. They did so carefully, respectfully, understanding that they were sharing something that felt almost sacred. Marcus Webb, the security guard, gave his first interview about that night in 2018. He was 73 years old, retired, and he said he felt it was time for people to understand what had really happened. It wasn't a fight, he emphasized. It was 2 people being honest with each other in a way that's almost impossible when you're as famous as they were. They gave each other a gift that night, even if it didn't feel like it at the time. Sarah Mitchell, the production assistant, wrote a blog post about her experience in 2019. She focused on the way the air in the corridor had felt charged with something beyond simple conflict. It felt like watching 2 people strip away everything they were supposed to be and just exist as themselves for a few minutes. She wrote, "I've never forgotten it. I think about it whenever I'm tempted to be less than honest about who I am." The photographer who lowered his camera never did give an interview, but he did release a statement through his agent saying that he was glad he hadn't photographed that moment. "Some things," he said, "are more important undocumented." Looking back now, more than 4 decades later, that confrontation between John Lennon and David Bowie stands as one of the most significant moments in rock history that almost nobody knows about. It was a hinge point, a moment when 2 different visions of what rock and roll could be collided, and instead of one destroying the other, they acknowledged each other's validity and pain. Lennon's accusations came from a place of genuine fear that the authenticity he had fought for was being replaced by empty spectacle. Bowie's response revealed that the spectacle wasn't as empty as it appeared, that beneath all his characters was a human being struggling with the same questions of identity and meaning that everyone faces. The music industry today, with its emphasis on branding and image cultivation, with social media turning every artist into a carefully curated persona, has largely followed Bowie's path rather than Lennon's. But the anxiety Lennon expressed that night hasn't gone away. If anything, it's become more acute as the boundary between authentic self-expression and calculated performance has blurred to the point of invisibility. Maybe that's why this story matters now more than it did then. Because in a world where everyone is performing their lives for an audience, where authenticity itself has become a marketing strategy, we need to remember that beneath all the performance are real people wrestling with real questions. Just like Lennon and Bowie did that night in a corridor at the Grammy Awards. Both drunk on their respective substances, both terrified of their respective demons, both brave enough to be honest with each other when honesty was the hardest thing they could offer. David Bowie never spoke publicly about that night with any specificity, but in 2003, in one of his last in-depth interviews before he largely retreated from public life, he was asked about confrontations he had had with other artists, moments when the facade had cracked. He smiled that enigmatic smile of his and said something that might have been a reference to that night. "I've learned," he said, "that the most valuable conversations are the ones where you stop defending yourself and start admitting what you're actually afraid of. Those conversations are rare. They're painful, but they're also the only ones that matter." John Lennon, in that Rolling Stone interview in 1975, was asked about Bowie specifically. He paused for a long time before answering. When he did, his response was cryptic, but perhaps telling. "Bowie's all right," he said. "He's more honest than he pretends to be, and that might be the most honest thing about him." Two men. One night. One conversation that almost nobody knows about, but that changed both of them in ways they probably didn't fully understand until years later. That's the real story of what happened when John Lennon, drunk and angry, confronted David Bowie backstage at the 1975 Grammy Awards. And now you know it too.